Speaking of Queensland, Queensland Senator Malcolm Roberts joins us tonight. Good to have you with us, Senator.
Thank you very much, Gary. Good to be here.
And the Renee Gorman herself from the IPA in Melbourne joins us. Renee, we'd like Victoria's jobless here in Queensland. It's awful.
Very, very true, Gary. Thanks for having me on.
And Queensland frontbencher from the state opposition, the member for Moggill, Dr Christian Rowan, also joins us here in Brisbane. Dr Rowan, good to have you with us.
Thanks very much, Gary. It's great to be here again.
Well, as I said, it's a pretty shocking indictment on the circumstances of the economy in Queensland, but it does impact, I think, agreeably nationally. But let's talk about the climate, drought, water policy and so on, because it is something that I have been continually banking on about ever since this program first went to air about 17 months ago. And a lot of people on this station, on Sky, have been very much so at the forefront of talking about drought policy, water policy. They need to actually get a national water policy to get dams built. And Senator Roberts, I know that you're on about it as well, but I find it astonishing when I look back at some of the manuscripts that are around now. 120 years of climate scare. We've had scare after scare after scare, and I found this article in the American Thinker really quite something that actually points to just how inane and how mad we are for jumping at every shadow and not getting on with building the infrastructure this country needs to get productive again.
Yes, you're right about the scares. You know, I heard recently that someone said we've got 12 years before we all become extinct. And Al Gore turned around and said, I've been saying that for 30 years. You know, so these kinds of things are just nonsense, absolute nonsense. And what I think is happening is the people in the Extinction Rebellion are actually doing the skeptics an enormous favour, because people now who were sitting neutral, ambivalent, are now coming out and seeing this is absolutely crazy. It's ridiculous. And I'll tell you what, Gary, I've actually got 6 of the 9 Green senators in Parliament. I'm living rent-free in their heads. They can't answer my basic questions, my basic challenge to a debate. And now they're coming around and taking it in turns to have antics behind me, you know, face plants and stroking their beards and laughing and catcalling behind me to try and put me off. They just seem obsessed by me because they know there's nothing that they can base their claim on.
Well, look, I find those sort of antics absolutely puerile and simply not good enough for any parliament, state or federal. And Renee Gorman, I mean, I say that a serious issue, Queensland's unemployment being up, part of it is, I think, off the back of the drought. There are simple tasks not being undertaken. Farmers are not able to even afford, well, they're not able to afford to travel anywhere. They're not able to get off the farm and come to the big city necessarily. Money's just not circulating, and this is a big problem. It doesn't need jokes and doesn't need stand-up.
That is incredibly true. This is not the worst drought Australia has had. We have had much worse droughts in the past. It's just been the most mishandled drought of all time, and also because we are not storing the water when we have it. The fact that the environmental movement refuses to build dams just shows that they value the lives of trees more than people. And the silly thing about that is dams are not bad for the environment. They actually build new environments and new ecosystems for animals to thrive. So I can't see why they would be against building more dams so we can help these farmers. But this is all rubbish that has come down, that has been taught in schools day after day. It's been 10 years since I've been in school, and when I was in school, they said that drought was because of climate change. But guess what? The drought is broke. Yeah. The drought broke, and there was another drought. Yeah. It's just part of being an Australian. It's part of living in the Australian landscape. What we need to do is prepare and manage these situations instead of jumping to climate alarmism.
Well, I think so, because it's lazy, Christian Rowan. It is really lazy. I mean, I mentioned this last week. I just simply put it in the paper, circulated to you all today, that it was back on my 18th birthday in 1978, the 5th of January, that it was declared there was going to be 40 years of climate cooling. I mean, you know, if you pay monkey scientists, you'll get all sorts of junk outcomes. I mean, but what are we going to do about dams? I mean, at the end, it's a state government responsibility. You're in the state opposition. Surely you must be going to build some dams.
Well, we are absolutely, Gary, and we've already announced that we would create a Queensland dams company to get the infrastructure that we need here in Queensland. There are significant water security challenges here in Queensland. The drought is affecting Queensland like many parts of Australia. There are many communities like Stanthorpe which are on the verge of running out of water, and water's vital for our agricultural sector, for farmers, for communities, for our mining and resources sector. And as you've said earlier, there are 178,000 Queenslanders without a job. The Australian Bureau of Statistics seasonally adjusted figure of 6.5% puts Queensland at the bottom of the league table, and that's a terrible situation for Queensland, which used to be the powerhouse of Australia. We now, have 178,000 people looking for jobs, and what that means for regional and rural communities. We are the jobless capital of Australia, and it's simply not good enough.
No, it's not. I mean, and Malcolm Roberts, that's despite the fact the state government have purchased 30,000 friends to join the public service in Queensland. I mean, it's just unbelievable. It is just unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, socialists are only stopped when they run out of other people's money. And what they're also doing in Queensland, these socialists in Queensland are actually destroying the asset base. They're destroying our productive capacity. There's a reason why farming and mining and fishing and forestry are called primary industries. They are the primary industry. That's the first step. And the socialists in the Labor Party and some of the socialists on the left wing of the Liberal Party have actually colluded to steal farmers' property rights. I'm thinking of Dan McDonald out in Charleville and right across the state. And now they're bringing in draconian legislation, which fortunately the Liberal Party says it opposes, to stifle farmers along the coast. I mean, they're just gutting everything. How long did it take Anastasia Palaszczuk to wake up and listen to the people and say, build Adani? It didn't take her too long once she finally realised to change. But these kinds of things are destroying our productive capacity. And what Rowan said about dams, Fitzroy, Burdekin, Herbert, we've got so many dams and people are just crying out for it. Exactly as we heard earlier on, it's not a problem of rain itself, it's the problem of how to manage the extreme variability in our rainfall year in, year out. That's the challenge. The drought was caused by weather. The drought crisis was enabled by slack, hopeless government.
Yeah, I think there has to be some vision. I mean, Renee Gorman, Malcolm Roberts reckons he lives rent-free in the heads of a whole bunch of colleagues in the Senate, Green senators. But I got to say to you, I think Andrew Bolt and Paul Barry's stoush this week has in itself proved that Paul Barry has a bit of space for rent as well. This whole Bolt-Barry stoush that's taken place, and I know that everybody at Media Watch will now be saying, oh, there's another Sky presenter having a go at the ABC. But you actually want them to stand up for country regions they say they represent. And what we're seeing instead is this sort of inter-city nufty kind of woke virtue signalling rubbish about climate change being the problem. Climate change is this. The climate keeps changing every year. That's what farmers know best of all.
Well, naughty Andrew Bolt for doing his own research. He should just accept what he's told like a good little boy. Well, Andrew Bolt is right on the money here, and he is unique amongst the media class for many reasons, but most of all because he does his own research and he does it very well, specifically on climate change. You can go back, 8 to 10 years ago when he's on Insiders on the ABC and he's talking about these same issues and he is arguing with facts and figures. And you can look at the other panellists on the show and they just look so smug. All they do is roll their eyes. They don't have their own facts and figures. They're just following the consensus. They're just doing what they're told. They just think that because they're following the crowd, they must be right. So good on Andrew Bolt for standing up on this. The elitists at the ABC may be against him, but I think the climate election, as the left dubbed it, showed that the majority of Australians are with him.
Look, I think so. In fact, I've gone through some old videotapes and found where Andrew Bolt interviewed me when he was on the insiders. When I was a minister, I've never met Andrew Bolt. I must do that. There must be a party that Sky's going to throw somewhere down the track and I can shake Andrew's hand and say, well done, mate. I can only but admire you from afar. But Christian Rowan, I've seen this whole kind of climate catastrophe coming. The language of catastrophe is now being offered to everybody. The Australian Weather Bureau have been out warning that, we have a storm season that hits North Queensland and the Queensland coast every year, but it's the emergency thing. In South Australia, it's about the bushfires. Never going to be anything worse than this year. There's this catastrophe around the corner logic that's now creeping into every year's worth of warnings. Now, I think that you can actually cry wolf a bit too often, and some people are just going to start tuning out soon.
Well, look, I think it's important, Gary, that we maintain balance and remain, that there's a methodical debate and an evaluation of evidence. I've got a science background as a medical practitioner, and it's very important to look at evidence, test hypotheses, and over time, science and information will change. What I would have done 20 years ago as a medical practitioner in some areas would not be what we would do now. So I think it's important that people maintain balance, that they continue to look at further scientific developments as they come forward to test hypotheses. And sure, we need to be doing as much as we possibly can to deal with the realities, the environmental realities, and what we've already committed to do from an emissions perspective within the national and international frameworks and protocols that we've signed up to. But it's very important to have rational debate and for people to not be moving towards belief and simply prosecuting beliefs as opposed to evidence and information in a very methodical scientific way.
And you get hammered. I mean, Malcolm Roberts, you get hammered. I get hammered. I mean, you're a bigger target than me in the Senate, but this whole business of the bushfires are stronger, greater. I actually heard somebody seriously the other day saying, right now it's hotter and drier, colder and wetter than it's ever been. Can you believe that that person said that exactly that same way? A person who should know better, and I won't name them because it's embarrassing, but they said it in front of a room of 200 people, talking about climate emergency, talking about things that are coming this year. We know that a lot of the bushfires that have occurred is because people have gone around and lit them. That's the emergency that's been created by stupid humans who should be prosecuted but won't be.
Well, you're absolutely correct, but let me read some figures. I did an analysis of 8 different ABC programs, radio and TV, back in 2013. Let's go back to Media Watch on Monday, March 21st. Here's the data. Directly or implicitly denigrating those who take a sceptic position on climate 12 times in a 15-minute segment. Contradicting empirical evidence and or facts 17 times. That's more than one a minute. Citing scientists, really academics, funded by government or in government positions 7 times. That's one every 2 minutes. Citing of independent scientists, none. And then we can look at Media Watch on Monday, May 30th, 2011. Directly or implicitly denigrating those taking a sceptic position, 8 in 15 minutes. Contradicting empirical evidence and facts, 8 in 15 minutes. Citing scientists funded by the government, 1. Citing independent scientists, 0. Personal value judgments, 12. Almost one a minute. The ABC doesn't have sceptics, won't entertain a debate, won't present the data that proves human carbon dioxide is affecting climate. The ABC has turned into a propaganda outfit that is peddling lies and distortions. And that's a bigger part of the belief, the religion you and Andrew Bolt and others mention. And that's what's doing the damage. It's not just the education system, it's the taxpayer-funded denigration of science and distortion of science and presenting falsities as science. And that's corrupting young kids' minds, and that's putting fear into people needlessly. The real terrorists putting fear and terror into people are the ABC and some of these climate academics.
Yeah, well, it's a cult. And Renee Gorman, I see The Guardian have now made a virtue, has signalled a virtue out of the fact that they're not going to be scared of talking about this climate catastrophe. They've actually produced an ad that says, subscribe to us because we're the ones that are going to scare the pants off you, basically.
Well, there's an old joke that a lot of people say, which is, this is peak Guardian. So I think this definitely falls into that category of you know, the guardian stereotype. But the good news is they're still asking for funds and they still seem to be desperate for any relevance. So this is just virtue signalling. I don't think it's going to have any real impact.
Yeah, well, nevertheless, it's a nice bright yellow thing that caught my attention. Shiny objects often do. Going to take a quick break. I want to come back and talk about the new big swamp that's growing in Canberra called the NDIS and a whole lot more. More after this short break.
You're watching Hardgrave on Sky News Live.
If you're passionate about newspapers like I am, Sunday night's edition of The Front Page is a must-see. We talk to industry experts about why press freedom is under siege. If you want to be prepared for what's coming, make sure you watch The Front Page.
Hey, Tina, can you please slice the lettuce, tomato and onions, toasted buns, grab the sauce and mayo and bring the meat.
Take a break from cooking and get Hungry Jack's Flame Grilled Whoppers delivered on Menulog. Order Hungry Jack's delivery only on Menulog.
Natural resources, developing tomorrow's talent, an endangered species, a place to flourish, a regional town, better access to doctors, a local school, more books in its library. How are they all connected? Through one natural resources company. Glencore. Discover how we're connecting possibilities every day.
Invest with La Trobe Financial, Australia's multi-award winning wealth manager, returning 5.05% on a 12-month investment. Make your money work harder for you. Call 138010.
The Toyota Country Music Festival Tamworth, Australia's biggest festival with the biggest lineup, biggest stars and the biggest experiences. 700 performers, over 2,800 free and ticketed events across 120 venues. Come and experience 10 days jam-packed full of entertainment. Toyota Country Music Festival Tamworth. January 17 to 26. Find out more at tcmf.com.au.
The second draw of RSL Art Union's luxury lineup is open. The chance to win 3 apartments worth $2.4 million in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, plus $200,000 in gold. Order your tickets at rslartunion.com.au.
Our perfect moment is when you have yours. Sail with Australia's best cruise line. Call your travel agent or book at princess.com. Princess Cruises. Come back new.
Without the right food, your fruit could be feeble. Rich Grow's Black Marvel citrus food is specifically formulated to create the Rich Grow effect for bigger, juicier fruits. Pick up a bag today and grow you good things.
This Whopper has no beef.
No beef!
Introducing the Rebel Whopper with a patty made from plants.
I've never had plant that tastes like meat before.
Tastes just like a Whopper.
It tastes exactly like a Whopper.
New Rebel Whopper, 100% Whopper, 0% beef. The burgers are better at Hungry Jack's.
Welcome back to Hardgrave.
Thanks so much for your company. We're in conversation with Dr. Christian Rowan, with Senator Malcolm Roberts and Renee Gorman. So we're in Canberra, we're in Brisbane, we're in Melbourne. And no matter where you are right around Australia and New Zealand, you're very, very welcome. The National Disability Insurance Scheme was meant to be the panacea to all known ills, and I hope that it works. Certainly getting various states to sign up to this enormous multi-billion-dollar plan has been an interesting, and not in a good way, transition. And people have been left behind. But what I thought was really quite shocking was the amazing amount of money that is being paid to less than 100 senior bureaucrats, $23 million in wages, while people are still wanting and awaiting assistance. It's meant to be bespoke, unique boutique packages to help people with their unique boutique set of disabilities. It comes at a cost, but I fear this thing is about to become a swamp. Christian Rowan, it is necessary that we actually do have things that work for each individual, a tailor-made package, but this cost is a bit embarrassing, isn't it?
Well, look, I mean, the NDIS is a very important transformational scheme, both socially and economically, in helping people with disabilities. And certainly you need to have the right people with the right skills to be able to deliver what is going to evolve over a period of time. And when you think back to the introduction of Medibank in 1975 or Medicare in 1983, and where they've evolved into now, particularly Medicare, it's taken many years and many decades to get to where we are now. So we need to attract the right people into there, and that's what the Commonwealth Government's doing. And Stuart Robert has indicated that they need the right people with the right skills to be able to continue to implement this across Australia. But in Queensland, disappointingly, the Labor government here has failed in its duty to get as many people as it can across into the scheme as of when it went fully operational as of the 1st of July this year. And certainly there have been many matters which have been canvassed through the estimates process and other ways whereby the government here in Queensland hasn't done enough to help those with disabilities.
So it is tardy in a couple of places. And Renee Gorman, the thing that I find philosophically a challenge is that you go to the public sector because you're given tenure. If you go to the private sector, you may be given performance requirements and therefore maybe can command a higher paycheck, but the tenure's not there. Now we're finding in the public sector that you're getting both tenure and the big paycheck. And I think that's what a lot of people are a bit sort of scratching their heads and wondering about. What do you think?
Well, I think this is a symptom of something that Milton Friedman talked about, a very long time ago, which is this is what happens when you're spending other people's money. You don't feel as responsible for it when it's not directly affecting you. So you're going to be much more frivolous with it. And I think that's obviously the case here. But these salaries are quite high, but they're not as high as some within the bureaucratic sector. Like, the head of Australia Post is on $2.4 million taking home every year. Higher ups at the ABC are on $1.4 taking home every year. These kinds of salaries are absolutely disgraceful and cannot be justified when they are being subsidised and fully paid for by the taxpayer. It's an absolute disgrace, and the government really needs to do something about it.
I mean, Malcolm Roberts, I believe very strongly in an effective public servant service, and I've certainly met and worked with a lot of very good public servants, and I had no idea what they were paid. But it does start to get frustrating when you find examples of constituents like yours out of places like Toowoomba, but people who are struggling to actually get food on the table while they're meeting the healthcare costs of a disabled child. I mean, these examples are now being obviously juxtaposed against somebody on a pretty big salary, a salary bigger than the Prime Minister.
Yeah, Gary, I was very pleased to hear Dr. Rowan's comments about the NDIS. We need something like that to look after people. The problem is the system. There are several problems with the system. First of all, it should have been left in states' hands, in my opinion. Anything that goes to the federal government that the states can do and should do in accordance with their constitution has been wrecked. And what happens in the federal government, there's no competition. There's only one federal government, and both Liberal and Labor play the same game. In the states, if one state fouls its nest, then people either leave that state or the government changes and they fix it up. There is a competition, and it's called competitive federalism. And it's written about in this book here by a former Liberal Western Australian Premier, Richard Court. It's a wonderful book. It's only about 40 pages, but he really does a good job of explaining it and why, at the moment, we are destroying accountability, which is exactly what Renee was talking about. And that is because there's no competition for a federal government. What happens is Labor, in this case, with both Gonski and education reforms and also the NDIS, just put a promise out there to try and suck up votes, and that was unfunded. And then no matter what the Liberals did, it was wrong. But the problem is I've listened to people all over Queensland. I can think of particularly a lovely family up in Toowoomba who have a really heartbreaking story. It puts enormous pressure on the parents. And they were under a good system with Queensland. Now they're in a mess. And going back to Renee's problems, with that lack of accountability comes a skyrocketing of salaries. From memory, a couple of years ago, the cheapest or the lowest paid department secretary, Gary, was on $650,000. Some of them went up to close to $1 million a year. and the Prime Minister was on about 535. So the lowest paid department secretary in Canberra is higher than the Prime Minister. That shows the lack of accountability in our Canberra, and we need to get things back to the states and get back in compliance with our Constitution. It really is a wonderful Constitution. We need to follow it.
Yeah, and of course, states want to flick more and more to the feds. Anastasia Palaszczuk was railing on the other day, saying, oh, the feds should fix the dam problems in Queensland. I mean, heavens above, don't let the feds be responsible for all these things. States build dams and water infrastructure. We saw that with Gladys Berejiklian and John Barilaro the other day with Scott Morrison and Michael McCormack. I mean, there is at least, out of that, a competitive federalism outcome. When New South Wales is standing up on water, where Queensland's not. Victoria, well, they reckon it's never going to rain there again, so they don't even worry about it. Tasmania have built 16 out of the 30 dams that have been built in Australia, 16 out of the 20 dams that have been built in Australia the last 30 years have been built in Tasmania for hydro. So you're right. I mean, competitive federalism is one thing. Let's talk about the battle of ideas. I mean, we'll step back a bit because there's a lot of philosophical talk about the idea of capitalism versus communism. And Renee, I am worried about this generation of younger Australians who actually see, like others in other parts of the world, some virtue in socialism. I mean, Venezuela's been put onto the UN Human Rights Council, heavens above. What they've done to people's rights in Venezuela is extraordinary. But capitalism versus communism and the way in which happy socialism is in fact being seen as a stepping stone to something far more totalitarian in some people's minds. We should be worried about this. Parents should be talking to their kids about this sort of stuff, Renee.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've been running events on campus for a while now, and no event is more popular and gets more students attending than our capitalist versus socialist debates, which are run between Generation Liberty and the Socialist Alliance groups on campus. We get crowds of over 300 students at these debates. But the good news is the students vote at the end, and not one time has socialism won. Capitalism always wins the debate. That is generally because the socialist debaters are too extreme. They're also hypocrites generally. We have these people standing up there talking about a working class revolution, kill the rich, but they are professional students that have been at uni for generally over 8 years. One of them owned a Porsche. So in their utopia, they would be rounded up and killed. But more to the point, I think there is definitely a backlash coming from young people going more towards the capitalist end of the spectrum. And I definitely think what is going on in Hong Kong is making young people wake up. Seeing other people overseas, especially young people, risking their lives, risking their safety to fight for the freedoms that some people take for granted is really taking young people's notice. And that's a really, really good thing. The left seem to think that young people can only rebel in one direction, but I don't think that's true. Young people rebel against the establishment. And right now, the left of the establishment, they're the people on campus try to tell us what to say, what to think, and what to do. And guess what? Young people aren't going to take that for very long.
I mean, Christian Rowan, I'm glad to hear people are actually getting fired up about this, because I think in democracies and in a capitalist society, people, you know, if you own something, you tend to want to care for it more. If you have a piece of the action, you want to buy into it more. So the whole idea that no care, no responsibility because there's no ownership, it doesn't really work for very long, I wouldn't have thought.
Well, all those points are very valid, Gary. And also the other point is that civics and citizenship education is very important for our young people. And that's as soon as our children are able to walk and enter into preschool and primary school and secondary school, they need to understand our great democratic institutions, how our system of government works through local, state and federal government and who's responsible for what, and to develop a sense of ownership of the state and the nation that they live in and the great freedoms that they have and the possibility of owning land and purchasing a house and being able to provide for their families. And when it comes to being educated about history as well, I mean, I think a lot of people, when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, they thought, well, that's the end of communism and other forms of socialism. And in fact, that wasn't simply the case. And it's very important that our young people understand history, understand the great risks of totalitarianism and what's happened before and the risks of socialism and communism, and that civics and citizen education within our country, within our schools and our curriculums continues to be fostered so that people cherish our great freedoms and values.
I mean, Malcolm Roberts, we just got to talk about it. We've got to talk about this stuff. We've got to get parents and grandparents to talk to their kids about it, to know what they run a risk of losing if they sign up to this kind of collectivist nonsense.
I agree with you totally, Gary. We need to get back to teaching history and we need to get back to teaching the Constitution. There is something else that I think is fundamental, and that is that capitalism or free markets align with the human spirit. Humans are meant to be free. Now, in Australia, because of our small population and large area, we also need to have governments controlling some of the essential services like energy and water. Now, I used to be a believer that somehow private enterprise should do that. We can't have private enterprise doing that in a small market where there's only one provider, and that should be the government. And what our the founders of our Constitution developed was competitive federalism, and that took care of the accountability, and we have destroyed that. But it comes back, Gary, to freedom aligns with the human spirit, and that's when humans are free with their creativity and their care. Underpinning every socialist plea is the belief that they are expressing care, when in fact they're really expressing control, the opposite of care. And so what we need to do is to teach people, teach our kids the values of freedom and how freedom is sacrosanct, really. And that's very, very important, because humans thrive when creativity is free to express itself and exchange with each other, and when people are free to express the care they have.
It's good to talk about values. You can't have rights if you don't take on responsibilities. Renee Gorman, I wanted to talk quickly about nuclear because I know that you're helping to promote a debate about the need for us to look seriously at nuclear power. And Malcolm Roberts makes a good point that in a country as sparsely populated as this, there's some things government can do, should be doing, and leadership on power generation is one of the things. Will the market sustain a nuclear power industry in this country?
Well, I definitely think that nuclear power is something that the government should seriously be looking at, especially with new technologies such as thorium reactors. So thorium reactors are much safer. They can be switched off at any point in time. And also, we have heaps of thorium in Australia right now. Their radioactive waste that they produce is much less radioactive. And also, these plants can actually be run off the fuel from nuclear waste. So there is actually an industry that could be provided here by asking other countries to pay us for us to take their nuclear waste and actually produce power for it. And I'm finding that more and more young people are really taking an interest in nuclear because it's a bit of a thought experiment, because they keep being told that climate change is going to, end the world. But then the same environmentalists won't look at a practical solution like nuclear that it provides stable power with no emissions.
Yeah, well, there is something in that. I think it is a debate that is certainly well worth having. I mean, Malcolm Roberts, Queensland could produce a lot of electricity with the uranium, and now we've got thorium. That's another story.
Thorium is an exciting story, or potential story. It hasn't been proven in the market yet. But the cheapest electricity sources by far, Gary, are hydro, by far. And we can combine that with our irrigation systems to green the inland of Queensland, and also to provide power for Queensland. The second cheapest is coal by a long way. And then the third cheapest is nuclear. And way, way back comes the so-called intermittent energies like solar and wind. And we have a right, and we also have a responsibility to produce that power cheaply, because the one thing that is consistent throughout the last 170 years of the Industrial Revolution is that ever-decreasing prices of electricity and fuel have powered the material development and the escape from poverty. China is doing that. That's why they're building coal power stations hand over fist. And so what we've done in this country is we've actually reversed the decrease in prices, and we've doubled prices in the last 10, 15 years. That is insane. We're exporting jobs to China. And what we need to do is get back to our core value, which is cheap electricity, and that attracted companies from all over the world. They're now abandoning us and leaving us with unemployment.
Yeah, no, we are obviously, if we're going to increase the price of electricity, we're going to increase poverty. It's not hard to figure out. Going to take a quick break. Want to come back and talk about how the left of Australian politics, well, is just still making it all about themselves. I cannot believe how much they just keep talking about themselves. So we'll talk about them in just a moment. More after this short break.
This is Hardgrave on Australia's News Channel. This weekend, 12 of the fastest horses on Earth will sprint. The world's richest race on turf.
Absolutely amazing.
It has finally arrived. The 2019 Tab Everest is here.
Don't miss a minute of the action. Tim Gilbert and Julie Snook, live from the Everest, 11 a.m. Saturday.
This program proudly brought to you by BetEasy.
On the next 5 years, customer centricity, finding out what your customers really want.
The customer is more fickle than they've ever been before.
Mostly online. In store for me.
I do both. Our expert panel on the essentials for providing better customer connections and service. Plus, the couple behind the global fitness sensation Sweat, a thriving example of customer centricity. So don't be left behind. Join me for the next 5 years.
Wednesday, 8 p.m. on Sky Extra.
The big one is back at Nissan. Get 1% finance and 0 deposit on popular Nissan models. 1% only at Nissan.
We miss you. Come for dinner. We're getting Hungry Jack's delivered.
Bring the family together. Get Hungry Jack's Flame Grilled Whoppers delivered on Menu Lock. Order Hungry Jack's delivery only on Menu Lock.
1 in 3 Australian workers are owed super. If only the laws were changed to make employers pay super at the same time as wages. That's how it works for our federal politicians. It's time to make super payable on payday for everyone. Authorised by B. Dean for Industry Super Australia, Melbourne.
People always say to me, you must read every newspaper under the sun. No, just one, The Spectator Australia. And you can too. Go to spectator.com.au and you'll get 10 issues for just $10. Ooh, yes.
This is the story of business. It starts with someone deciding it's time to move forward, to make it bigger, faster, more beautiful, even when it doesn't feel like it. Every story of business starts with someone saying, I will do this. And they're the ones who take us all further. They're the ones who've pushed us to become Australia's biggest business bank.
NAB, more than money.
News you can trust. Opinions you can't ignore. On Sky News. Welcome back to Hardgrave.
And welcome back to you in conversation with Renee Gorman, with Senator Malcolm Roberts, Dr Christian Rowan, member for Moggill in the Queensland Parliament. Well, Christian Rowan, as you know, in politics, if you're the issue, you're in trouble. And at a time of this sort of narcissism that we're seeing in the federal opposition and Labor generally, I don't understand why they're not remembering that. I mean, you've got Theo Theophanous, the Labor luminary from Victoria, writing more things about more of these issues as they're trying to position themselves for the review into the May 18 federal election that apparently they lost, although some have only just started to come to grips with it. You've got Christina Keneally being piled on by all of her colleagues and wondering whether or not she really does speak for the party, whereas everybody knows that Christina has been told that she's the next Labor Prime Minister of Australia. I mean, this is not a good look for them. And you've got Kayla Murnane, the New South Wales outgoing General Secretary, getting hundreds of thousands of dollars in payouts. If you were a branch member of the Labor Party, you'd be starting to wonder whether you wanted the card, Christian Rowan.
Well, that's exactly right, Gary. I mean, federal Labor continues to tear themselves apart after May 18 and they have really lost their way. They're captivated by the left and they took policies to the election which didn't appeal to the ordinary Australians, to the the silent majority who are out there. And if we look at what's been happening in New South Wales with ICAC down there and the donations and what's been happening with Audi bags and the amount of money and payouts that have now been given to people, it's really quite extraordinary. So the Labor Party really has its work cut out for it. I mean, they are captivated by the left. They're not coming up with policies that appeal to ordinary Australians. And again, in Queensland, you know, we have some dire economic circumstances here. $90 billion of debt in the next 4 years, unemployment at 6.5%, 178,000 Queenslanders on the scrap heap, no plans when it comes to water infrastructure or dams, let alone building the hospital, the bridges and the roads that we need, or the educational infrastructure for a growing population here in Queensland.
And they're doing stand-up on the floor of the Queensland Parliament. I mean, I don't get it. I mean, Malcolm Roberts, I don't know whether you saw any of that stuff, but to see Grace and Jackie Trad competing with each other for doing impersonations of characters out of Finding Nemo and thinking that is parliamentary debate is outrageous. The Labor Party have also got the problem with the union movement. I mean, the CFMMEU, Michael O'Connor, Brendan's brother, is having a go at free trade agreements. I mean, the Labor Party are just constantly coming back into the headlines for all the wrong reasons. How do you cope as a sort of got to like them both some days kind of party?
Well, you know, their behaviour shows that they're following the Greens in that too, not just Greens philosophy. And that's the problem with the Labor Party. It's lost its way. It's abandoned its core. It's no longer servicing the needs of honest workers. It's now after the fringe votes and trying to gobble them up and outdo the Greens in insanity. I thought the Greens had it to themselves, but Anastasia Palaszczuk and Jackie Trad are coming up rivalling the Greens. And it really comes back to the previous discussion you started, Gary, and that is on values. Because when people lose touch with values and lose touch with the basics and with everyday Australians and the people's needs, then they start falling for anything. And that's what we're seeing in the Labor Party. It's lost its way. I mean, there wouldn't have been a more tight backer of the Labor Party than the coal miners around Australia. Hunter Valley abandoned them, a heartland of coal mining in this country. Central Queensland, the heartland of coal mining in Queensland, abandoned them. I mean, Labor hasn't got anything in the coal, any representative in federal parliament in the Queensland coalfields, none at all. And it's going to lose the Hunter next time, I'd say, because people are wanting to come back to the basics. And that's what it's all about. And Labor has long lost the basics.
Well, I mean, One Nation, Malcolm Roberts, One Nation just about took that seat, Hunter. I mean, Joel Fitzgibbon's only there by the hair on his chin, really, a few percent. If you count Nationals' preferences, if they were swapped tightly with One Nation, it would have really knocked Hunter off. I mean, the point, I guess, is the thing that I get upset about is that my father's a metal machinist, my grandfather was a labourer on a council, pick and shovel work. Another bloke was a truck driver. I mean, I don't come with silver spoons in my family history. The workers, the farmers, the doers, the risk takers, they're the people that are actually saying the Labor Party doesn't represent me anymore.
That's correct. And when I graduated from university as a mining engineer, I went out and worked 3 years in underground mines and one surface mine around the country to get practical experience. And I loved working as a coal miner. It was absolutely wonderful, especially underground, because there's a team environment. And I know how people think and what they want. They just want to be left alone to get on with their lives. They don't want government intruding. And they're tired of the Labor Party meddling. And increasingly, sadly, the Liberal Party is now meddling, telling us how we run our lives. And people just want freedom, not control. They just want freedom and government to get out of the way and just provide the services efficiently and effectively. I was up in town in Mount Isa a couple of months ago, as well as last week. But a couple of months ago, I bought something at the Woolies supermarket, and I got talking to a 55-year-old, roughly, lady in the checkout. She works 2 jobs, sometimes 3 jobs: McDonald's, Woolies, and I've forgotten where the third one was. And she said that she is absolutely sick of the level of taxation for someone on her income. She is absolutely even sicker of the waste of money from Canberra. So these are the basic things. And who's leading the pack in waste of money? The Greens, followed by Labor. People know that they've lost touch, and we've got to get back to the basics. And I think the Labor Party's actually lost when you look at what's happening with the coal miners. They're tired of it.
Renee Gorman, are you hearing the same thing around campuses amongst younger Australians?
I don't think campuses are really the place to look at here because they generally seem to be the more extreme microcosms at both ends. But I think what we're seeing with the Labor Party is symptomatic of what's happening all over the West with centre-left parties becoming radical left parties. You have Jeremy Corbyn in Britain. You have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with the Democrats in America. And this all comes down to a problem that the left don't know when they go too far. They don't seem to think there is such thing as going too far left. We have Democrat members refusing to condemn the acts of a violent group called Antifa. They seem to think that the ends justify the means, and that's a very, very dangerous path to go down.
Yeah, and indeed they want to get us to pronounce pronouns properly and efficiently, and all sorts of other obscure things that seem to pop up from time to time. The basic core value thing is a big issue, Christian Rowan. It is a matter that we've just got to spend a lot more time talking about. What are you going to do?
Well, look, Gary, I mean, supporting our key fundamental values is a tenet of the LNP here in Queensland, and we understand that our freedoms and our values are very important. Our young people need to be educated in those, and as I've said earlier, in relation to civics and citizenship, that is very important. But one of the things that we're seeing in public debate is by controlling language, you control thought. And by controlling thought, then you end up with the real risks of extremism and totalitarian forms of government. And that's a real risk that we need to be very mindful of. So ensuring that our young people understand our freedoms and our values, our democratic rights, and with rights come mandatory responsibilities. Responsibilities back to your community.
OK, Christian, I've got to say goodbye to those watching us on WIN. Catch you next time. Paul Murray Sunday. And keep going, yeah. And
so coming back to that point, Gary, I mean, rights and mandatory responsibilities back to your community, back to your fellow citizens, being a part of the community and contributing and doing all the things that we need good citizens to do for future generations.
Nothing like the dignity of doing. Now, let's talk about Victoria now, Renee. Because you're in Melbourne, you're therefore now fully responsible for everything that's happening in Victoria. No, not quite, but Daniel Andrews has dumped on Victoria. I mean, to drop hundreds of documents on the state opposition last night, expecting them to get their head across it. I mean, this just shows, to my mind, the complete disparage and disregard this bloke has got. He won that election last time despite a whole bunch of misgivings from those who are watching on from other states. So he now thinks he's completely invincible. The virtue signalling capital of Australia is Melbourne, and there is a genuine and real problem, slowly but surely going to unravel the state government in Victoria, I reckon. But all these documents that have been released, the complete disregard for the parliament is a very slippery slope. It's basically saying we don't care about the people.
Yeah, this was definitely a very sneaky and underhanded move by Victorian Labor Party. They obviously hoped that by releasing all these reports at the same time that they would go unnoticed by the public or that the public would be overwhelmed. But I think it does indicate that the Labor Party's not proud of their record in Victoria. They're a little bit ashamed. They're trying to hide it. If you're proud of your record as a state government, you would not be doing this. And I think the person that needs to be the most ashamed is Andrews, who gave himself a pay raise despite being one of the worst premiers in Victoria's history. Hopefully Victoria is going to wake up sometime soon and get rid of this absolutely abysmal government.
Well, they got it for a few more years, and I mean, in the meantime, they can kill the economy. I mean, Malcolm Roberts, things are bad enough here in Queensland, and I keep saying that the Palaszczuk government wants to be Victoria light, but they've actually achieved something Victoria hasn't been able to do for a little while. They've got the worst unemployment anywhere in Australia. But if he's going to do things like make it difficult for things like Portland cement, heavens, what do you need cement for? I mean, what do you need cement for? This is a big and genuine problem. Victoria, the cost of doing business in Victoria is just going to go up and up and up. Maybe they'll come to Queensland and create jobs.
Well, there's a pattern here, Gary. There are actually several patterns. Jay Weatherill destroyed South Australia following Greens policies through the Labor Party. Absolutely destroyed it. And Daniel Andrews followed his policies. But the thing that let Jay Weatherill off the hook on 2 elections was not just their smart campaigning and targeting of marginal seats, but the weak opposition they had in South Australia. It was deplorable. The same thing with Daniel Andrews. Prior to the last election, we read about 21 members of his parliamentary team under investigation for abuse of taxpayer funds with electioneering. We didn't hear anything from the opposition and in the Liberal Party down in Victoria. Weak again. That's how Daniel Andrews is getting off the hook. And then we come to Queensland, where we have a history of Peter Beattie doing similar things, releasing bad news on holidays, on sporting festivals and so on. But in Queensland, we have an atrocious Premier, an even worse driver of the Premier in Jackie Trad, but we have a weak opposition leader in Deb Frecklington. And there's no coherence. I mean, Deb Frecklington, some time ago, came out with a policy of gutting coal and coming back to renewables. The next day, the Liberals in Canberra followed our lead and said, let's support coal. And so we don't know what's happening. So my fear is that Jackie Trad and Anastasia Palaszczuk will be let off the hook by Deb Frecklington. And we saw the behaviour of Tim Nicholls last time when it came to preferences. I mean, how insane can you be when you preference the Greens and Labor ahead of One Nation? It's just unbelievable, and that's what allows the left to come in. Then we see the abortion coming in, being loosened. We see the stealing of property rights even more strongly. We see the destruction of agriculture on the East Coast. These are due to the Liberal Party because they could have been in power, but instead they preferenced Jackie Trad over the Greens, and that got her back just. They preferenced the Labor Party ahead of One Nation. That lost them the election. This is insane. The Liberals have got to start standing up.
Yeah, well, Christian Rowan, I can't expect you to be able to talk about that because preferences is an organisational matter, but either way, is there steel in the spine of the LNP opposition is what he's basically challenging you about?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we have a great leader here in Queensland, in Deb Frecklington here in Queensland, so I can't agree with Malcolm's comments around that. I mean, we are very focused on delivering a government for Queensland which will ensure that jobs are created, that debt is lower, that the infrastructure that's built, that there's water security, that we invest in the roads, the bridges and the dams that we need, that our hospitals get back on track. If we look at the disastrous situation of ambulance ramping return, longer waiting lists, rural maternities in crisis, there's been IT blowouts, the disgraceful renaming of the Lady Salento Children's Hospital, let alone ensuring that our schools get all of the air conditioning that they need for our children and the curriculums decluttered. So we have terrific policies. We're working extremely hard. We're holding this government to account each and every week. And as you said, Gary, I mean, the release going back to Victoria with Daniel Andrews dumping all of those reports, that's the same play that Anastasia Palaszczuk did last year in 2018. I mean, the government up here in Queensland tries to avoid scrutiny. Every parliamentary sitting week, they put gag orders around the debate on important legislation by fixing the times and denying members of parliament the right to speak on important pieces of legislation. I mean, this government here in Queensland, the Palaszczuk Labor government, is anti-democracy, it's anti-jobs, it's anti-regions, it's anti-workers, and it's certainly not delivering the vital services that we need here in Queensland with respect to health and education, and very importantly for rural and regional Queensland, water security for those towns and for vital industries to make Queensland the powerhouse that it once was.
Yeah, well, there is something in all of that, and either way, it's a debate that is important to be had. And I looked at the numbers. If you actually total the LNP and the One Nation votes together, you knock the Labor Party off. But there's some pretty tricky boundaries here in Queensland, pretty tricky state boundaries. And of course, today, the Queensland government, Peter Gleeson released it on the front page last night. They've announced tens of millions of dollars going to greyhound racing. In fact, 3 times the money going to greyhound racing that they're refusing to spend on a dam in Stanthorpe. I'll let people work that out for themselves. Meanwhile, in Victoria, just to have a look at a couple of the things that are currently being talked about, congestion taxes in Melbourne, councils going off their brain, hating Australia Day. I mean, there is something seriously wrong in Victoria, but no Victorian will listen to a Queenslander telling them what we think. They'll ignore us completely. But I'm sure Victorians are going to work this thing out slowly, one thing leading to another. When the trams stop running over summer because the electricity's not there, I reckon Victorians will have a view. Renee Gorman, thanks so much for your time. Senator Malcolm Roberts, thank you for yours as well. And Dr Christian Rowan, appreciate very much your contribution tonight. Going to take a quick break, reset, more in just a moment.